Black sky, stop fake. Today we will talk about the reaction, especially on the Ukrainian internet, to the Russian aggression that affected Poland on the night of September 9th to 10th, 2025, when 19 drones flew into Polish airspace.
19, наскільки пам'ятаю, дронів.
Today, my friend and editorial colleague, Artur Zhak, is recording this podcast with me. Hello, Artur.
Hi, Dmytro. Hello to all the viewers of our podcast.
So indeed, this event gained extraordinary publicity on the internet. Although, of course, we would have preferred it not to have happened at all. It provoked a stormy reaction in both Poland and Ukraine. However, it was particularly intense in Ukraine. Why? Precisely because we are already living in a reality where Russia attacks us every night with hundreds of drones and missiles. Recently, there have been consistently over 100 objects. And sometimes, as was the case when Russian drones flew into Polish territory, there were several hundred. We have been living in this reality for over 2 years, if I am not mistaken, or more or less that long. And very often, when Russian drones and missiles flew to the very west of Ukraine, let us remember Lviv, where Russian drones and missiles killed an entire family. Let us recall Lutsky, which was attacked repeatedly, or Stanisławiv, now known as Ivano-Frankivsk Stryj or Drohobych, from which you often broadcast live Artur. Each time during such attacks, we observed the same scenario. The Polish Air Force scrambles its aircraft and simply observes the developments. This was also the case on the night of September 9th to 10th. Let us also remember that several of these 19 drones, correct me if I am wrong, entered Polish airspace.
Yes, 19 objects have been confirmed at this point. Some debris from unmanned aerial vehicles has also been found, and it is now being determined whether this is the result of the attack on the night of September 9th to 10th, or whether it is a drone or drones that flew in at a different time. But as you said, since 2022, Russia has been attacking the entire territory of Ukraine with airstrikes. From day one, as you mentioned, Russia attacked Ivano-Frankivsk and Lutsk, and a few weeks later it attacked Lviv. Well, maybe not the city itself, but the Yavoriv training ground in the Lviv region. Russia used to use a lot more missiles. Now it uses more drones. And in fact, we as a society living in Ukraine have already developed procedures for how to act. Similarly, the state and the armed forces have developed their algorithms. Everyone knows what to do at any given moment.
Actually, Piotr Mateusz Bobołowicz is showing us one of these memes. At the top is a Ukrainian meme depicting Ukrainians during an attack. It shows that during a drone strike, most Ukrainians remain in their beds. Although, in principle, it must be admitted that this is unreasonable behavior, and below we see the Polish reaction to these incidents. Sorry for interrupting you.
Так, продовжуй, вибач, що я перебив.
In today's world, memes appear immediately after every significant event. In fact, they are generated almost exponentially and usually describe our reality quite accurately. But in this particular situation, I would be very cautious with such sarcasm directed, for example, at Polish society, the Polish state, or any other European Union country. It is necessary to distinguish between the two realities in which these societies function. We, as a society that has been living in a state of war for almost 4 years, both legally and de facto, operate completely differently, both as citizens and as the armed forces and the state. On the other hand, countries that are not under martial law operate differently. The fact that, for example, not all drones were shot down over Poland, because only 4 out of 19 or 20 were shot down, and the way in which this was done also provoked many comments on the internet. Memes appeared suggesting that they were shot down using F-16 and F-35 fighter jets, which are very expensive. This was also joked about in the Ukrainian media. Who can stop the rich? Was the most common rhetorical comment.
Although, excuse me, we also shoot down drones, among other things using F-16 aircraft.
Yes, because the air defense system is multi-vector, which means it must be multi-level in order to respond adequately to any threat. And of course, such sarcasm is appropriate for us in the media, on the internet, and especially in memes. Yes, the meme itself is mainly a sarcastic commentary on our reality, but in such dangerous times, we should be careful with such jokes for one simple reason. European countries, namely Poland, are allies of Ukraine. Of course, you can sometimes joke, sometimes be surprised by the reactions of Europeans, but the most important thing is simply not to discourage or negatively influence European societies. After all, these topics are very quickly adapted to the Russian Federation's narrative. Russia simultaneously denied that these were their drones and ridiculed Poland and its reaction, claiming that the Poles were unable to neutralize all the means of attack that Russia had used. The most important thing is simply not to join in with this chorus of Russian propaganda.
So let's see what memes we have prepared. This one seems very apt and accurate to me, if we take into account the convention of sarcasm. Poor Lukashenko is covering up for Poland. We remember that Lukashenko said that he even warned Poland and that Belarus even shot down some drones. He talked about drones, but did not specify whose they were, the ones that flew into Poland. Well, in my opinion, it's a good meme, just like that.
Так, а це також мем, який доволі смішний, так, бо це безпосередньо.
And it's also a meme that's quite funny because it's a direct reference to the border blockade when there were protests and trucks were blocked. It's really funny. But on the other hand, in a situation where Polish society was terrified above all by the uncertainty of what was happening, terrified by the fact that at one point people didn't know how to behave when the alarm sirens started wailing, and many didn't know what to do. I think it might make people smile, but in Poland it might be perceived in a way that is, I would say, not entirely appropriate.
В Польщі може бути відібране в спосіб, не до кінця я би сказав, відповідний. Хоча,
This is understandable because, as you said, people in Poland are not living in a state of war, and we sincerely pray and hope that this will never be the case, that Poland will not experience what we are experiencing here, living in Ukraine in a state of war. But here it is really important not to overdo the sarcasm, not to play into the hands of the enemy, into the hands of the Muscovites, simply not to cross the line. Yes, Ukrainians can joke, even harshly, about Poles, but we are not in a position where we can safely afford to do so, because with such jokes we simply risk discouraging our neighbours and allies from helping us.
Допомогу від наших сусідів і від наших
Well, this is another meme related to the border, where Polish farmers solemnly welcomed Russian rockets. I can only comment on this in the following way. In Ukraine, this blockade of the Polish-Ukrainian border, which lasted many months, was perceived very painfully. Of course, we particularly remember the cases when, unfortunately, on many occasions, Ukrainian grain was dumped on the road and railway tracks. Because for us Ukrainians, a nation of eternal farmers, bread is something sacred. That is why many Ukrainian memes focus on the topic of the border blockade.
In our materials, whether in radio reports, podcasts, or live internet broadcasts, as soon as these protests began, we said that they would affect both Polish and Ukrainian society, that they would affect entrepreneurs, both Polish and Ukrainian. To this day, we can see that this is still a hot topic in Ukraine. Even in private conversations, you can hear people say that the Poles are blocking the border, even though there have been no protests for a long time. 2 weeks ago there was some kind of blockade, but it lasted no more than a day. Perhaps Polish farmers simply have other things to do? What is even more amusing is that 2 weeks ago, they were protesting not against Ukrainian farmers and transporters of Ukrainian grain or other agricultural products, but against the terms of the Mercosur agreement, i.e., against products from South America. This only elicited smiles from most of the Polish and Ukrainian public. It is difficult to explain why Polish farmers are protesting against South America on the border with Ukraine. But this is all the more reason to pay attention to this issue, so as not to fall into the trap of Russian propaganda, both on the Polish and Ukrainian sides. I agree with you, Dmytro, on this issue. Unfortunately, Ukraine is not in a position to downplay this topic. Ukraine is in a more difficult situation than Polish society or the Polish state. Therefore, we, as citizens and people who publish materials in the information space, must also remain vigilant.
But there are memes circulating on the Ukrainian internet, not only about Poland, but also about NATO, as can be seen in this example. Let us remember that Poland belongs to the alliance, but it should also be noted that just recently there were discussions in the Polish government about Poland being able to shoot down Russian drones and anything else that Russia might launch over Polish territory without obtaining the consent of NATO or the European Union. Such an initiative is appearing in Polish government discourse.
Звісно, ті меми про НАТО, вони не нові.
Of course, these memes about NATO are nothing new. Sarcastic images and comments about the deep concern caused by the actions of the Russian Federation in NATO and in the West in general have been a recurring theme not only since 2022 but since 2014. Therefore, it is hardly surprising. But what we talked about before recording, Dmytro, if you follow the Ukrainian information space, and not just the internet, memes, or short forms, but even the mainstream media, you often get the impression that the most radical opinions of the Polish political class represent the mainstream of Polish politics and public sentiment. And that is not true at all. These are just extremes, both in politics and in society. One must take actual actions into account. The Ukrainian media often referred to the new president of the Republic of Poland, Nawrocki, as a Ukrainophobe. Of course, his approach to Ukraine and aid for it is somewhat more reserved than that of Andrzej Duda. Yes, and that is also understandable. Almost 4 years have passed since the start of the full-scale war. Andrzej Duda was in office before the invasion. He often visited Ukraine, and the Ukrainian president visited Poland. This means that these relations were completely different, more personal in nature. But if we consider the actions of, for example, the current president, the fact that he signed a bill extending protection for Ukrainian citizens and refugees, that he spoke about Russia's imperial policy from the UN podium. The same can be said about Minister Sikorsky, the head of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I don't know if there are any world leaders whose statements on Russia have been more radical than those of the Polish minister at every level.
Це було якраз польського міністра на кожному практично рівні.
Саме так, польський міністр...
Yes, Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski is very popular in Ukraine. I would like to add one more meme, a Ukrainian one, about the alliance's activity or inactivity. NATO explains to Poles how Article 5 works. It's a well-known scene from the movie Men in Black.
Сцена з фільму «Люди в чорному».
Excuse me, Dmytro, I would just like to add one thing. For 30 years in Poland, in Polish politics, the belief has been forming that NATO is a guarantor of security, that whenever something happens, the alliance will help Poland. And the more aggressive actions the Russian Federation takes, the more often both politicians and the Polish public begin to ask the question, okay, NATO, that's great. Article 5, wonderful. But what can we do on our own if, for example, NATO, as in these memes, says it is deeply concerned and only initiates consultation?
Ну і на сам кінець ми маємо...
Finally, we have a short Ukrainian video by a group called Frionais. It has English subtitles. Let's see.
Frionis. Давайте подивимось.
Пане, російські безпілотники перетнули наш простір повітряний. Негайно підіймайте авіацію і оглядайте. Оглядати? Так, тільки оглядайте. Чи не становлять вони небезпеки для нас? Схоже, вони змінили курс і прямують в Україну. Бардзо добре. Але, пане, то ж наш простір, і ми могли б знищити їх. То не наша війна. Хай летять туди, куди їх скеровали. Я ж казав, жодної небезпеки для нас. До речі, Україно! Перестань нарешті тягнути нас у твою війну. О, курва!
Ну, я назвав би цей фільм...
Well, I would call this video accurate on the one hand, but on the other hand, I would note again that we are not in a situation where we can irritate, scare away, or in any way distance ourselves from our partners. It must be said that there is currently a stereotype in Ukraine that most Poles are Ukrainophobes. This narrative is strongly supported by Russian propaganda, which is untrue. Of course, there is a certain segment of Polish society that fundamentally believes that this is not Poland's war, that Ukraine is dragging it into this conflict. There are also those who sincerely believe that Ukrainian drones were flying over Poland on the night of September 9th to 10th. But these people are not in the majority.
Але цих людей не є більшість.
Саме так.
Exactly. Monitoring groups that analyze the information space have already shown that the majority, almost 60%, of comments about the Russian Federation's attack on Poland on the first day, even on the same night when the drones were flying, were generated either by automated bots or by so-called agents of influence. That is why sometimes you just have to log out of the network. Sometimes you have to leave Twitter, because if you base your opinion only on what you read on the internet, Polish, Ukrainian, or global, you can completely lose your mind, simply go crazy.
Let's add the most important thing. The official position of the Polish government is fully supportive of us, and the Polish authorities continue to support Ukraine. Well, that was the podcast Black Sky Stop Fake. Subscribe to us, watch us, and to victory.
До перемоги.